Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this last session of season 2 of Art and Protest. I'm going to be very brief because Vasyl is here speaking from an undisclosed location in Ukraine, and I'm very eager to hear what he has to say. Vasyl Cherepanyn is head of the Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv. He holds a PhD in philosophy with a focus on aesthetics and has lectured widely at universities and institutes in Frankfurt on the Oder, Helsinki, Berlin, Stuttgart, Vienna, Warsaw, and Greifswald. He has also been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Cherepanyn has co-edited several volumes, including the Guidebook of the Kyiv International in 2018 and 68 Now in 2019, and is also the curator of projects such as the European International at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and Hybrid Peace at the Stroom, which is a Center for Visual Arts and Architecture in Den Haag. Founded in 2008 as a platform for collaboration among academic, artistic, and activist communities, the Visual Research Center is the organizer of the Kyiv Biennial and a founding member of the East Europe Biennale Alliance. In 2015, the center received the European Cultural Foundation's Princess Margaret Award for Culture, and in 2018, the Igor Zabel Award Grant for Culture and Theory. The title of Vasyl's talk today is Art in the Shadow of War in Ukraine. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Take it away, Vasyl.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for this kind introduction. And first of all, I would really like to express my deep gratitude for hosting me today. And just from the very beginning, I just have to say that it was just half an hour ago that we had another anti-air raid siren. So it may happen again. So in that case, I just have to warn everybody here that I will be switched off for half a minute in order to go to my cellar here. And then I will be back, I hope, in a safe mode. So first of all, that's really my great pleasure and honor to take part in this absolutely great series, because it mirrors very much the very exact profile that the institution that I am running has been working on for years and years. As Kevin kindly said, I'm running the Visual Culture Research Center based in Kyiv, and we are also an institutional organizer of the Kyiv Biennial. And but actually, especially with regards to the topic of today, I had to start off this talk by saying that, of course, it's a kind of a strange and tricky position that I'm placed in now, because I am like, I'm going to describe and to outline some processes in and developments in the art field since the last Maidan revolution till the current full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, I have to be blunt in that regard, that just not to pretend that I'm still in this kind of a cultural framework, because the cultural field in sociological sense, as well as other social fields in my country, have been totally ruined because of this full-on assault on Ukraine. So we are all on kind of a wreckages of what used to be our society and our state. At the same time, I think it's also a very important moment, and I do perceive this invitation as a solidarity, genuine gesture, especially under the current circumstances. Every voice and every opportunity does count. So in this sense, I would just like, again, to express my thankfulness to all the organizers, particularly to Kevin, for this invitation, just because I am pretty privileged because I still can sit here in a relatively safe mode. I still have light and running water, unlike millions of my compatriots at the moment. So I will use this opportunity to its full extent in order to convene the messages which are also very urgent at the moment, because apart from elaborating on all those artistic and political developments that we have had during the last 8-10 years, I think it's also very important to stress and to refer to the current war urgencies that we all face at this moment, especially because many colleagues of mine have already literally lost their homes and their houses. So they are not just displaced; they have no place to get back to return to. So in this sense, it's again my big privilege to be here with this honorable audience. And also one, perhaps another sort of methodological note is that, as I already said, that I am running this cultural center, Visual Culture Center in Kyiv. Though I've been teaching at many universities, including Kyiv, for many years, but I'm not coming directly from the. So I am kind of raised in the academic field, but at the same time, my background is also pretty much in political activism and public art field. So that's why I think it also pretty much has influenced the type of knowledge that I can present, but also my ideological stance in a way. So in this sense, I think this will be also influenced with regards to what I'm going to talk about. And just for those who are writing in chat, unfortunately, I'm not available. I'm not able just to follow all the developments over there, just because I can only do more in a way monotype of. I cannot do stereo. Also regarding the chat, but you are welcome also to leave your questions, and I am really very much looking forward to the discussion after my short talk, just because having like half an hour or even less, it's so also thinking about this time frame that I was proposed to fit to. I also thought that because again of these current catastrophic circumstances that we are in here, it would be rather very important not to give a kind of a concise history of what Ukrainian art has been about during the last like 10-15 years, but I would rather stick to more a kind of a sociological, even I would say, or culture studies manner to depict the scene. But I will be using more, so to say, kind of wide brush strokes in order to present the general situation also. Because I am speaking both from the personal university perspective. At the same time, also, I pretty much share my institutional, politically engaged perspective. So, and in that regard, I also would start off by saying that in this sense, throughout my collective institutional experience, we have been always claiming our institutional, our political, engagement and social involvement, working with our counterparts across Europe and elsewhere, also in the US. But at the same time, I think this kind of situation that we arrived at since the February 24th, it put us all in a pretty tricky condition, because it's also a very big challenge in a way. What I encountered during my communications with many counterparts in the so-called collective West, that not all of the institutional representatives are eager and willing to, those especially who had been proclaiming their political involvement or their politicality as such, they appeared not to be very much willing to go to direct political gestures at this, so to say, moment of truth. I, of course, understand these restrictions because of the state or public affiliation and so on. But at the same time, I also think that's very important to stress, because this is exactly about the institutional and public and social aspects of the art developments in Ukraine throughout the 21st century in general, that basically this politicality was at the core of those developments, because it's we already are somehow adjusted and used to these kind of typical claims about the political involved art, and it became already fashionable, of course. So we usually hear these questions which are being posed on many symposia and conferences and gatherings. What art can do to make a political change, what culture can do to make this political change. But I think this is also very symptomatic, especially from the perspective of the current warfare, that somehow it's also the result of this, in a way, general inaction of the West. Because, and that's exactly the political inaction, because we've observed these processes in which politics as such has been in a way outsourced to soft fields like art, culture, whereas the professional political field has been left to neoliberal technocrats and right-wing populists. And that's why people in a way are trying to find answers in culture, political answers in culture and art, trying to find out what professional politics cannot provide them with. And I think this is exactly the symptom of our current predicament. So in that sense, I would say that it's basically these questions, and that's exactly what the Ukrainian art has been doing for many years, is exactly to reformulate this stance. And instead of asking what art can do to provoke a political change, a real political change, which always comes at a price, let's not forget that, and we sometimes with violence, if we speak about revolution. I will try to elaborate a bit on that later. But instead of asking about art, it's better to reformulate, to, in a way, to reinstate our own political involvement, what we can do to make a real political change, not just some culture or arts, because it's also exactly kind of mirroring our constant situation that we have been in, that those problems and also those challenges that I will be also referring to, these are not just those things that we face as some fashionable curators or artists or pure academics. These are the problems that we all face as just ordinary or not ordinary citizens, as political subjects or political animals, even if we go back to the ancient roots of democracy, so to say. So in this sense, that's why I propose this title, that Ukrainian art has been always very much about, how should I put it, about prefigurative politics, that in some sense, that's why it has been always so much directly connected to political, ideological, and social developments. There are many, many reasons for that, and I will name some of them. But at the same time, I want to stress this distinct feature of the artistic field in Ukraine, this really direct connection and somehow envisioning the political possibilities, and even more, those which are really realistic, which are possible to be realized in what is in German called Realpolitik. But in another feature that that is worth to be mentioned here is just again, sociologically or socially rather speaking, we have to take into account that there is a huge kind of institutional difference between how the Ukrainian art field looks like and what is going on in the West, of course. In Ukraine, I mean, not only a national or like context, but rather, and not just this kind of a local context, but rather a trans-local context. So here I also refer to the post-Soviet space as such, but even broader to the East European context. So in this sense, especially here in Ukraine, the main really difference is that I'm also again speaking from an institutional perspective. We don't have this clear and prepared stable background which you can rely on, like for instance in the West. So every time you try to do anything, you have start pretty often from not just from zero, but from big minus. So you have to prepare circumstances in order to prepare circumstances in order to prepare circumstances in order to start to work. So in this sense, it's very much defining for the modus operandi of artists, curators, and all kinds of cultural practitioners here, just because you don't have an kind of an institutional autonomous zone where you can, so to say, solve artistic problems without being threatened from any kind of intervention from the outside. So in this sense, I would say that Ukrainian art field is not autonomous in the sense that it's not so much professionalized, that it doesn't have, so definitely that there are many, many professionals here, but I just mean that you don't have this social, in a way, buffer zone, this kind of a skeleton that you can rely on that defines the functioning of the field. So especially if you are in an institution which is trying to impose this critical liberal leftist or whatever you call it, critical social stance. So it's really very challenging in that regard. But at the same time, if you compare it to the Western situation, where it's pretty often that even pretty transgressive gestures are easily swallowed by the mainstream and don't have direct political consequences. We don't have this, but at the same time, it's really interesting that because of this kind of toxicality, if I may put it this way, of the situation, that it only seems that you are working in the art field or the cultural field, but actually you are working in the open social field, which has totally different rules, not like the professional art field. So it also creates these circumstances which are in a way politically productive, because you can directly influence the ongoing processes in education, in social life, in politics, even in the professional politics, even in the media. So I find this really interesting to stress that it's pretty usual that you are placed here in this kind of situation when you like represent an institution, for instance, or some artistic trend. You have to fight enemies in a very direct sense. It's not just some opposition in the art field that you are facing. Sometimes it can be really pretty violent situation, even like with regards to the current war. So in this sense, I think that this also influences very much the type of art which has been produced, but also the way the art field operates in society as such. And I think also if we are speaking in reference with regards to these social and political developments, the main thing I think in order to understand it, to have a general grasp of the artistic developments here, is that somehow it's really very interesting, and perhaps I don't know any other country which can be really symptomatic in this sense, that art here is really very much dependent on the revolutionary developments in a way, because all the actual critical and political art that we have had and we still have has been somehow, it just emerged only thanks to the revolution and only because of revolution as a phenomenon. Because in the 21st century in Ukraine, we've had already two successful so-called Maidan revolution, which refers to the name of the central square in Kyiv, but also which became a kind of a symbol, but it's actually a Turkish word. So we can also speak about Maidan in Tahrir Square, and so on. So because these, especially the last Maidan revolution, which was a kind of a local manifestation of the global wave of so-called square occupation uprisings, and which was really successful because it managed to topple down a bloody authoritarian president. And that's exactly the reason why we have been attacked from the Russian side. So in this sense, the war itself is also a type of counter-revolution, which is pretty, I mean, you can find many historical examples for that as well. But I think that this is really a defining moment, just because it was exactly because of the revolutionary event, be it the first Maidan in 2004 or the so-called the second one in 2013-14, that various artistic waves of those activists and artists who were directly involved both in revolution as well as in their professional activities, I mean like arts in general. So these were the basic reasons why we have political art in Ukraine. So that's why I mentioned this really direct connection between art and politics in this case. So and I think this is very much connected to the so it's interconnected, or it's connected on both sides, because Maidan itself actually in terms of visual culture has been it was probably the most powerful image that Ukraine as a country has ever produced. So it was a kind of sort of a ready-made in Marcel Duchamp, in avant-gardist sense, that it was a kind of a ready-made for all kinds of interactions, including the artistic ones, as well as, of course, social and political ones. But this is really important because also on the one hand, it was such a powerful really visual event that had been constantly broadcasted and across the whole world. But at the same time, it was a kind of a playground for different artistic interventions, including ours, because we as an institution were directly involved in this uprising as we were running the so-called opening university of Maidan directly on the square together with the protesters. So this, on the one hand, this constant medialization of this political installation in the center of the city really worked out in the sense that because of its visuality, because of this visual accent, it has finally won. And this is somehow what is really unimaginable. That is exactly, you can learn from this really in the artistic sense, how revolution can be really visually produced and can be a successful one. So it was really kind of a Joseph Beuys dream, this kind of a framework in which everybody could be an artist. But it was actually the so-called first Maidan, the revolution in 2004, so-called Orange Revolution, which produced the first wave of politically involved artists. And just to give a brief outline of this field, I would say that it's really important that because before we had as a mainstream in the artistic field those artists which were rather valued for their art in the more decorative or commercial sense. So only because of the revolutionary change, we got also this artistic change, that first of all, first wave of young Ukrainian back then artists who were born from the revolution directly in a way. They were even called Generation 2004. This was the first appearance of those autonomous, self-organized groups. And what is really important, that this collective nature of a revolutionary action has been translated or had been translated into the artistic field. So they also borrowed this collectivity from politics into the modus operandi of their own. So that's why they were favoring collective actions instead of individual ones. They were based on collective art practices. They were very much sticking to collective curating instead of individual one. So I think all these features were exactly of a political, stricto sensu origin. And this also affected very much the media they started to use, because that was also the moment when artists switched to more into and started to stick more to these kind of public actions, to performativity, to artistically exercised, so to say, social critique. So we can name here such groups as Revolutionary Experimental Space, REP group in Kyiv, Soska group, for instance, in Kharkiv, Hudrada Artistic Council, which was created later, but also in Kyiv, Open group, more in the Western Ukraine from the very beginning. So this was also a very important feature that we got in the artistic field from the political activity as such. So that also is very important, that art is really very much inseparable from societal developments, and can directly affect and is being affected by social political real imagination. So in this sense, as just as have several minutes left, I would also say a couple of words about this kind of period between the 2014 after Maidan and the current full-on assault of Ukraine, because the war itself, of course, started just right after Maidan in 2014. So in this period of time, art as such has been placed like really literally between revolution and war. Not just because the war started only now, but it's just because it has been constantly ongoing just in the east of our country. So in this sense, especially after the revolution, artists across Ukraine have been challenged by the fact that after the revolution, it was a kind of social void, or even internationally speaking, how to present Ukraine. So I would say that during the last 8 years, artists were pretty much busy with the problem, a pretty classical problem for the art field, with the problem of representation, which, as we know, is in constant crisis, both, by the way, in political and artistic sense, right? Crisis of representative democracy, of representation in arts, and so on. But here it also had this direct political sense, because Ukraine had been misrepresented or almost totally absent on the international level, just because since perhaps till 2004 Orange Revolution, it had been just displaced and desubjectivized, because it had been always, of course, Russia who was in charge of this whole post-Soviet space, by the way, with the full acceptance and support of the West. It's another talk, but it's really striking how the Western countries, which are so much obsessed with following the colonial trend in their own working through the past, are totally blind with regards to the same matters outside their bubble, right? So that's why artists were also involved in this political task of creating a proper narrative, as Ukraine has been an untold story in a way. So that's why I think that was one of the main challenges that the artistic field faced after the revolution. Another one was, of course, not just war, but it has a visual sort of flip to that, because what we are dealing and what we are like softly calling Russian propaganda is basically, of course, it's just a substitute term, because we are dealing with the military troops only in the visual field, in the media field, right? And now it's more than obvious, of course. So in this sense, we have to take into account always that the war machinery, especially having the war with Russia, this war machinery has been in constant fusion with the media field, with the media spectacle. So in this sense, that's why they're exploiting the staged media spectacle. So in this sense, they're exploiting some type of aesthetics, some type of, I would say, terrorist visuality, right? So that was also one of the challenges. Now it's, of course, even beyond any level, but that has been always also a challenge for Ukrainian artists to face and to create some counter answer. And that is also a problem, because not just to be seduced to go to some type of primitive counter propaganda art, right? But to trying to find a visual language also on the media level to present, which would be really effective to counter this terroristic war visuality imposed by the Russian Federation. So that's why I think one of the characteristic features of the art field, all the variety, all the media we can take here, is this kind of dedication to the document as a kind of as a main medium, I would say, because like cinema verite or this arte povera, right? I mean, these kind of associations that you might have, but this is exactly it, that this reference has really a pretty political grounding, because document, at least in its genuine sense, always pretends to speak truth, right? So this kind of searching for truth and living according to the truth and speaking truth has been really defining feature of all variety of arts since the last revolution. So it's also pretty effective. So that's why we've had a boom of documentary filmmaking. like also in arts and in gallery spaces. So it's also because of Maidan, which was very productive for documenting as a process, but also the war itself in the East. So the process of documenting things, reference to the document as a main medium, I think is really one of the main characteristical features of the arts. And the last one, just to put a comma here before we go to discussion, is basically such a process as so-called decommunization, right? Which was started right after the Maidan revolution and imposed first by the Ukrainian state. It was also partly supported by different right-wing groups, but it's basically, it's not just so-called Lenin's fall, right? Like demolition of Lenin's monument across the country, but also this, it was a kind of an attempt to erase all the communist or rather Soviet traces from the cities in terms of, and villages as well, in terms of renaming the streets and toppling down the monuments. So it's very kind of a tricky and unclear process, which is still going on, right? So on the one hand, it's totally understandable for historical reasons, because the idea of the left here, especially in the post-Soviet state space, is totally different from the one that you can perceive being in the West. Right, so it's a very problematic mixture of the the Soviet authoritarianism and dictatorship, and Russian invasion, and so. But at the same time, as an answer to that process, the artistic field was very much busy, in a way, with claiming its socialist past as well, and that was also a very distinct feature in both in artistic and the political sense, just because and it also got a form of which we as organizers of the Kyiv Biennial since 2015 have been always very busy with that, in terms of also architectural heritage, for instance, because the socialist aspect of the Ukrainian, but also in general the Soviet past, right, is very much connected to the heritage of modernism. Because unlike in the West, again, here modernism is not associated with this kind of colonialism and the Western offensive against other nations. But here it's rather that because this kind of modernist stance in the avant-gardist sense had been totally repressed in the 30s during the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union, but then after the Second World War, in the late 60s to the late 80s, we've got a revival of modernism. It was so-called the second wave of modernism. So in this sense, especially with regards to East European context, especially to the post-Soviet one, there was really a very fundamental and powerful wave of modernism across many countries. So in this sense, it was not socialist realism, but socialist modernism that was really defining artistic trend here. So in this sense, I would say, as the last feature of the Ukrainian art between revolution and war, so to say, it was this claim to not just to preserve, but also to revive, in a way, some modernist heritage, because it's perhaps the only trend in artistic and political sense from the late 19th century till now, which, as we know from Habermas, is not only unfinished, but which is super contemporary and that we can learn from. So basically, being modern is something that we can draw a lesson from the history of 100 years ago. Thank you so much again. I'm sorry for being too long, I'm looking forward to the debate. Thanks again.
Thank you, Vasyl. That was a lot to chew on there. So I think I just want to encourage everyone, please, to chime in with your questions and comments. Please put those in the Q&A. Don't use the chat for that, but the Q&A, and we'll get to those as soon as they start coming in there. It's hard to know where to start. There's a lot here. It's very interesting the way that you describe the really unique place that art has in Ukrainian society and contrast that with other places where, you know, as you say, there's kind of a social buffer zone, and there's kind of a, you know, this is a two-edged sword in a sense that on the one hand, there's no social buffer zone, so that just in order to do art in the way that you're trying to do it now, you have real political fights on your hands. I mean, you're, you know, in a way, more and possibly even more than political, violent enemies, as you say, that you have to deal with in order to just, you know, set up this kind of space. But on the other hand, you know, you don't have the situation that you have in the West, where anyone who wants to do art or to make some kind of a radical statement through art is I mean, it's kind of absorbed by the system and really loses any kind of a radical voice that it might have had to begin with. It just gets co-opted essentially. So I thought that was really pretty fascinating to consider. The question of whether or not art is enough or not enough is something that is a question that I think it seems to me you're saying, you know, I mean, art is not the way to address the situation in Ukraine right now. Am I right in that?
Well, I mean that in a way we know that the owl of Minerva always flies out at the midnight, right? So in this sense, I think, yeah, of course, because, you know, I mean that it's also the question, because if the current situation, unfortunately, I'm not speaking metaphorically really, but because if the current situation drags on in a literal sense, I mean, in some time, we won't have not just some biennials or art projects here. It would be just really burnt out land, which is already a big part of Ukraine, right? So I just hope that we all, like throughout the world, I mean, especially in the West, just have enough courage to step in and to prevent further atrocities, to speak honestly. So, but I hope, but I think that judging from the previous, well, it's very hard to judge from the previous past, from the past, but at the same time, I think that it's already kind of a very interesting situation for the arts, and I think that we will see lots of, and we already see this, lots of interesting pieces and writings and productions in terms of art on the ongoing situation, and I think it will be even more later on. But I just don't see clearly the way in which art can like respond to this directly. So of course we can think of conceiving some joint projects somewhere in the West, right? But at the same time, I think that's also not by occasion that many artistic initiatives, and I think that's also the answer to this question, honestly, that many artistic initiatives, many institutions, even museums, turned into kind of activist platforms at the moment, right? So we on behalf of the Biennial, for example, on behalf of the Kyiv Biennial, since the first days of the war, we also for the full-scale invasion, we also launched a kind of an emergency support initiative, just gathering funds to support people across the country, those who need some basics like food, medicine, accommodation. But also, I think what is really important, and now artists are also doing that, I think this is very important, really, and we are also very much involved in this. supporting those activist-based initiatives which are focusing on documenting war crimes, Russia's war crimes here in Ukraine. I just hope that sometime soon it will be part of the court case against the Russian Federation in the Hague, or I don't know where. But also another thing, which is also very important, I think, and artists and art practitioners are directly involved in that, is that helping those smaller museums and initiatives which are evacuating museum collections and artworks across Ukraine, especially in the heavily bombarded regions. So these are also two other dimensions which are very crucial for the artistic field as such.
Okay, thanks. There's some questions starting to come in now that I'd like to get to. First of all, I'll just start with this one from Isabel Galviera, who asks, what can artists and institutions in the West do to show solidarity and help the current situation in Ukraine? You sort of started in on that, but do you have anything in specific that you would like to say about that?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question, I think, because yeah, I started my talk with reference to that, but I think yeah, so not just to over politicize, so to say, because we all understand what are the frameworks that different institutions are put in, right? But at the same time, I think in really strictly artistic sense, I think this is now really very important. That various cultural institutions, especially in the West, shouldn't just stick to some, humanitarian general stance. Of course, it's very important, like in terms of practical humanitarian aid being provided to Ukraine, without which Ukraine, of course, wouldn't survive through this war catastrophe. But hosting refugees, this is really very important. But if we think politically ahead, really ahead, for the near future, I think what is really important is for the cultural institutions is to work with those artists to select, if we are speaking about Ukrainian cause and the outcomes and of the ongoing war, right? And to select those projects and to conduct those projects which create constant discomfort. I think the main thing here is not to let your respective governments in your countries, as well as your audiences, your publics, not to let them feel self-satisfied, as if they are doing enough. So it's never enough until the war is over. So I think that the main political role in the current predicament of the cultural institutions, especially in the West, is to create as much discomfort as possible, to put as much pressure as possible to change this status quo. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Got some more questions in here. One of them is just actually a question I was also thinking of, if you could say something about the situation in Russia with artists there. I mean, there are several people on the call who have been involved in some Zoom meetings that have been happening on Sundays, trying to bring together Ukrainian and Russian and other artists to talk about this. The situation in Russia right now, the question here is actually, do Russian artists work in the same ways as Ukrainian artists, or are they so controlled by authorities that they are unable to speak the truth? So I'll just leave it at that, but I'm interested in hearing what you think about Russian artists who are trying to speak out against the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's also really crucial, because it's very, very multi-layered situation, of course, because we do have, and I mean, as an institution, we had been collaborating with, I cannot even name those critically involved and politically engaged Russian artists with whom we didn't work. I mean, not only artists, but also academics, activists, I mean, for years and years. But this is pretty multi-layered, as I said, situation, because, first of all, this game that the West is currently playing when equally declaring support to Ukrainians resisting the Russian military, as well as to those Russian dissidents opposing Putin's rule, especially in exile. It's really very insulting equation, just because you cannot compare the suffering of the people who are being killed by the Russian military with the inconveniences of some Russian civilians. But another aspect to that is that basically, let's not forget that for the last centuries, Ukrainian culture has been not just put in the Russian imperial shadow, but simply robbed of its heritage and modern actuality and forcefully provincialized. And that was done by the Russian Empire, then afterwards by the Russian within the Soviet Union, and now by the Russian Federation, by the way, with the full acceptance of the West. And that is also another reality. That is exactly, so that's why this current fight is also part of Ukraine's decolonial struggle. That is also has to be said. And at the same time, I think with regards to the current situation, that that the current form of the fascist military dictatorship that the Putin's Russia turned to be, that it didn't come out of the blue just yesterday, right? It took years to be established and to reach this point of no return. So of course we know how hard it is now that you cannot speak up, and it was also super hard. But again, it's just the question what price you are ready to pay for the real political change, because you cannot wait for the beautiful Russia of the future to come, as they sometimes say, especially somewhere in under the Western protection. Because the regime change in Russia won't happen in Berlin or in Amsterdam or in New York, but only in Moscow. So this kind of radical dissident political language has to be tested by radical political dissident action. And of course, it's now we already saw these attempts, but at the same time, let's not forget that after this full-scale invasion, we saw just a few thousand of individual protests across the country with over 140 million people. I'm sorry, but it's also the objective. So maybe it's not objective situation, but that's the reality that the Russian Federation has. But I think that this situation became possible just because for the last 20 years, especially the Russian citizens themselves didn't pay enough attention to that in order to change this profoundly. Because, you know, if you swallow one day the Chechen war, which brought Putin to power, if you swallow political assassinations like of journalists, of oppositional politicians, if you swallow the total cheat of any elections, state censorship, closure of free media, constant tortures, systemic tortures in prisons, then what would you have, and why would you wonder at when the leader of this country is pronouncing totally, in a literal sense, fascist speeches, like according to the Nazi playbook? So that is something that only Russian citizens themselves have to deal with. Unfortunately, now not only Ukrainians are dealing with this in a very literal and very harsh and violent way, but first of all, this is the problem of the Russian society. We know from the German experience in the 30s and the 40s, right? This idea of collective responsibility and collective guilt. But it also means that nobody can escape this. So unavoidably is always a personal one. So I think that is the lesson that Russians have to learn, I hope sometime soon.
So yeah, no, I'm just thinking, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, it really does come back to the question of, because I do know and I also personally know a lot of artists in Russia who did not wait until today to stand up, but or in fact have been artists who've been really since the turn of the century and even before that, very actively out fighting against what's happening in Russia, identifying Putin as the problem, and really, but what you can say about them is that they haven't been able to overturn Putin. And if I mean that seems like a, you know, I mean, for the arts, I mean, I think it's a great question, because yeah, I mean, it's a big ask for the arts to be able to do that, but that's kind of your point here, right? Really, it sounds like to me is that, you know, it takes more than the arts and you know, this attempt to use our art as a way to mobilize support isn't really, in your view, that effective.
Yeah, I just, maybe that's right. Yeah, thanks so much. Maybe that's now a right moment to show this photo that I asked you to show, just because I think that's the only image that I would like to show during this talk, because actually it's I think very telling, in the sense that now we will see it. So it's basically it was made on the very last day of the Maidan uprising on February the 20th, 2014. And I suppose it was made by, it was taken by some British journalist, but this is a great picture which shows, yeah, exactly this one. Thanks so much, Kevin. So it's the very last day of the Maidan uprising. And I'm really proud perhaps to be among some of the people who are over there still. But you see basically almost total burn down, right? After the very heavy face-off against of the protesters against the heavy armed police, and because of these constant heavy police attacks during the last days of the revolution, it was a total burn down of the square itself. And it's very telling, because you can see that basically the Maidan square on the last day became literally like Kazimir Malevich Black Square. So that is the price of the revolution, I mean. So that was the also of the revolutionary violence as well, because regime change cannot happen just you know, simply marching and on the streets and doing art. It's much more, as Kevin said, much more than art that has to be involved in order to denounce, of course, especially Putin's regime. But I mean that you have to be ready for something like that, in order, if you really take it serious, if it's not just some playing around in the white cube space and making this kind of radical chic activism and activist art somewhere in the West. So, and artists were also part of this, and I just mean that we just have to keep it real as much as possible, because without that we will be still talking about the lost opportunities and possibilities that we had, but that were unfulfilled. If you are really serious in that regard, both in arts and in politics, then you have to go ahead with that. Because I'm following here basically this famous statement by German philosopher Walter Benjamin. I mean that as he put it precisely, that behind every fascism there is a failed revolution, right? And modern Russia is a country of a suppressed revolution, exactly because of this openly fascist leader. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. It's unbelievable, but we're already almost out of time here today. I'm sorry that that's happened. There are a lot of great questions in the Q&A, and I wish we had more time to get to those. But clearly, this is a situation that I think has really been clarifying in a lot of ways. The question of violence versus art is one that I'm very interested in. And from my own perspective, working mainly on radical social movements and art in Western Europe in the 60s and 70s, that question was a big one then too. And there were a lot of people who felt both ways. What happened there, as I'm sure you probably know, is that particularly in Italy and in Germany, there were the people who felt strongly that, you know, violent resistance was what was needed, really ended up provoking a reaction on the part of the Western governments that pretty much destroyed the entire oppositional counterculture in Europe for a decade or more. So I guess the idea of feeling the necessity of actually picking up arms and fighting in a real way against it is understandable. My own concern about that is that the results of that may not be what the people who pick up arms really want. And it seems like there have been times that that's happened around the world. So it's a question.
Right, Kevin, but at the same time, it's also the when it also, you know, it depends how close this situation is to you in terms of your survival. So when you hear, like, not just a fascist manifesto, but the fascist action which aims to exterminate you as such, then there is just no other way out than to, because either you stand up or you are dead. Either you will be killed. So that's the only outcome, unfortunately.
No, I understand.
It's really very, very sad that we are again in this situation here.
It is indeed a very dark moment, and it's a sad way to end this second season of Art and Protest. We have another year of it coming up to be followed then with a major exhibition on art and protest and international conference where hopefully, you know, one of the issues we can really dive into is that question of, you know, really making a difference through art or not, and, you know, what the alternatives to that are and that sort of thing. But for now, I want to thank you again, Vasyl, for joining us today. I'm glad that we had this opportunity for you to bring your message out to people. It's the least that we can do. And hopefully it's not the end of the conversation between the two of us. And I hope to see you and have the chance to talk with you. Hopefully.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
So,
very grateful. Yeah, bye.
Thank you to everyone. Goodbye.